Hey everyone, this is Gabby,
and KARIM.
and you're listening to the Making of an Incredible MD podcast by Allied to Health.
Tune in each week to hear us talk about the journey of getting into med school.
From GAMSAT to medical interviews, get the insider scoop from med students who have done it all before. So stay tuned and get ready to get med ready.
Hi guys, welcome back to the MMI mini-series episode where we'll be running through mock stations. Before we get started, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am recording today. For me personally, that is the Yora people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander listeners who might be listening to this episode. Getting into it, the type of station that we're doing today will be station number 3. It's an ethics station. It's quite a challenging ethics station. In terms of the timing, there'll be 5 questions in 5 minutes, which is rather challenging to get through. You'll see the student doesn't actually get through all 5. The student today is Mark and the examiner is KARIM. The station itself is as follows. In some countries, opt-out organ donation schemes are implemented, which means that all individuals are registered as organ donors and must opt out or leave the scheme if they do not wish to donate their organs. The first question is, what are some of the ethical issues with this scheme?
Okay, so I think, okay, if we consider first the individual, very cold-hearted to say, well, yeah, they're dead. But I think when you consider, especially for family reasons, for religious reasons, for a lot of the reasons like that, obviously that's something that may be contrary to, their desires and their family's desires. Obviously, some religions believe in afterlife and things like that. So there's a lot of, whole can of worms with that. But then I guess from a utilitarian perspective, or, for the betterment of the most amount of people, if you think about it in perhaps a more cold way or just a simple economics or numbers way, I think then it absolutely has its benefits. So I think it's kind of I think if you think about it as more of like perhaps for the good of the betterment of the more amount of people versus perhaps the individual's wishes or their families and religion, I guess, are probably the major components of play here.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. What are some of the reasons that people might wish to opt out or not be a part of this scheme?
Yeah, so I've kind of mentioned that already. Same reason I think that a lot of people have different desires. So my mum's a solicitor and I get to witness a lot of will signings, and a lot of people have very vastly different reasons. A lot of people, they roll their eyes when asked what they want to do with their body and all this, and they don't really care about it. Whereas some are really concerned about that, be it for religious reasons in the afterlife, their family's desires. My grandfather's passing was just recently, and we went to the mausoleum and saw his body. So depending on sort of your upbringing and your background, there may be vastly different reasons for your what you desire to do with your body afterwards. At the same time, maybe if you're the benefactor of an organ donation in your life, you may have a vastly strong, a real pull towards that. So I guess, you kind of ask what more so, why would you not? But I think those would be some of the bigger reasons. An individual desire, a family desire, and perhaps a religious or an upbringing background.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think people who opt out of this scheme will be ostracized?
Well, I think, it would depend on whether, how anonymous that decision is, how much that is broadcast, and also the people around them. I think in an ideal world, that would be an anonymous decision. And I think if people thought about it for a minute, like I've just been put on the spot here to do, I'd like to think that people would understand that everyone has different upbringings and backgrounds and things like that. The reality is, in the same way as maybe it's a bit of an apples to orange comparison, people may judge other people for what political background they have and what they vote in an election or something like that, where you'd like to think that people would understand, okay, you're voting this for this reason or something. That's probably not the reality, where, people may judge you for thinking one way or another. So I'd like to say that in an ideal world, yes. I've one depending on how they view it. The reality is there may be, depending on how anonymous this is, who the people around you are, who's asking, there absolutely may be some risk of that. And I think it'd be important in implementing a system like this, or when designing it, that you would have that anonymity so that people can make it based on their own judgment. Because I think the goodwill of a thing like this, which is designed to help other people, goes out the window if people are doing it for the wrong reasons. If people feel like they're doing it because they don't want to get shamed at the supermarket by their friends, I don't know how great a public health system this is. Yeah.
Okay. Do people who opt out of the scheme deserve to receive organs if one day they need them?
That's a tricky one. I think it would depend. I think it would depend on. I think that they would have to be aware of this when they opted out. I think it should be based on goodwill and not. It's not really a hey, you're doing like this is your decision. If there's a huge punishment for not doing that, so I think. I think that if you were to implement a system like that, I think it would have to be abundantly clear in the process of when you were making that decision. My gut reaction to that is that's it would be very unfair if people knew that, if they didn't know that ahead of time. However, I could see that also being perhaps a bit cold-hearted. I could see that being an effective system. If you ultimately are trying to get more organs, I could very much see that as being an effective system, which may push some people that are perhaps on the fence, because, for a serious thing like this for saving lives, maybe if feelings are a little bit hurt, or maybe if there are some negative repercussions, maybe that's a justifiable thing in some, maybe that could be easily justified if it is saving lives. So I think not the worst thing in the world, but it would have to be abundantly clear at the time.
Unfortunately, it's time. So we'll leave it there. But I really...
Was there any questions I didn't get to?
So there was one more question. Maybe for the benefit of our listeners, we can just go through it at a more casual pace. You can have a think about it. So the last question was, is there any situation in which the rights of an individual should be sacrificed for the greater good?
Ooh, geez, okay, I guess the first thing that comes to mind is vaccination. And I'm sure you're probably alluding to that. And that's a real can of worms to open in 1 minute. It's kind of a conversation I've been having with friends, and it's like, I'm not going to, so most of my friends don't come from biomed or medical background. And I was listening to a podcast about this recently, how to communicate with people from a non-science or non-medical background about it. The best thing to do is not to sit down and explain to them, live attenuated vaccinations or mRNAs and stuff like that. But I think it is important to convey the message that if you are making this decision, you are affecting other people. So I think as long as it is aware, as long as they're aware, as long as people have been presented with the facts, I absolutely think so. So, for example, in the case of vaccinations, I do think that there should be some way. We've seen what the plateauing is at people's goodwill. I think there has to be some form of pushover. Understand that, okay, when you make a decision that it affects other people, that is not just something that's your choice. It affects the betterment of everyone. We're going into another lockdown. So I do think that, yes, once you make a decision that centers you but affects other people, there should be an effect on it. So I can have to give a quick answer because it's only 1 minute.
Yeah. No, that was great. So well done. That was it, really. So for the sake of our listeners, but also for yourself, like how did that feel in terms of time, pressure, the overstation, the difficulty? How would you describe it?
It was cool. It was it's interesting. So I've been listening to quite a lot of these. I'm doing my PhD at the moment, and I'm listening to a lot of them in the lab just because kind of have it on the background. And what I try and do is pause, answer the question myself. And one thing I do have trouble with is when you don't know how many questions they're going to ask, it's very, how long is a piece of string? How long do you answer for with trying to hit the key points, but also not knowing how many questions they're asked? Like say you'd answer, you said 3 to 5 questions. If you stopped at 3 questions, then I'm sitting there and asking you about the weather for 2 minutes. So I think it's a hard thing, and obviously I'm pretty early in my practice into this. It is hard to go, know how much to answer. At this, if you change your answers, you can come across of not presenting one perspective. So I enjoyed it, but I'd like more time practicing, and hopefully over the next month or 2 I can get better at that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a really reasonable answer to that, and definitely, like with these stations, you just don't know how many questions you're going to get. But I think the promising thing is that markers don't care about how many questions you get to. It's more about the quality of your response to overall questions.
So without knowing their marking sheet. They don't go question 1A, 4 out of 5. Like you're not getting penalized for not hitting that entire thing, are you? Or
from my understanding, I don't think so. Obviously, no one really knows because they don't typically release this information. But I really don't believe so. I think what the examiners are looking for is overall just how you respond to these questions. Obviously, you don't want to just stay on the first question for the entire 5 minutes. You do want to get to like at least question 3 or 4. But yeah, I'm sure you sort of felt that like 5 minutes goes by really quick in these stations.
oh yeah.
And you know, certain universities definitely have very short station times in general. But I thought your overall performance was really great. You came up with very similar points to what I did when I went through some of these questions beforehand. So going back to question 1, what are the ethical issues? This is a very common question to start off a station. They want to see how you structure your response. They want to see that you can get to like lots of different ideas that they're going to unpack in further questions, essentially. So you mostly talked about autonomy and then differences in beliefs in society and in culture, which are really the key points of the station. Obviously,
so can I just say one thing on that? So like having listened to quite a lot of ethics stuff, and I was listening to I can't remember exactly one, but I remember listening to one of the podcasts of you guys, and like the dude was like really knew his stuff, but at the same time he sounded like a textbook. And so like for example, like I tried actively not to use the word autonomy. Where do you stand on that? I mean, just on my gut feeling, I would prefer to be conversational and talk to them like just on my how I'd feel probably more comfortable. How do you feel about that? Because I feel like if they're 9 hours into the day, they really don't want someone spouting off the 4 pillars of medicine. You know, so where do you go from on that?
But I will say that sometimes using those words does sort of just highlight specific things for them, and then you can sort of go into that term a little bit further. I honestly don't think they mind, to be honest. I think that they just are looking to tick off certain criteria. You know, when you bring up autonomy, they're like, okay, great, this student sort of understands autonomy, but you can also talk about it in terms of free will, you know. They're going to understand exactly what you mean. So you don't have to be a textbook. You don't have to just say the exact words they're looking for.
Because you can tell when someone knows their stuff, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword in which, you know, they're not like there's a reason people don't go to a textbook they go to a doctor.
Exactly. That's a good way of putting it. The only other thing I had was just considering that this is also a life-saving treatment. So you talked about like the benefit to society in general, but also the fact that this type of treatment is really important, like it's life-saving. And the parallels that I'll draw between organ donation is obviously blood donation, right? So blood donation, very similar ethical things to consider, like autonomy, benefit to society, once again, life-saving treatment as well. So those are some of the things to consider, but there's not much else in this particular station. You know, justice maybe, like all people have right to access it. What else? Non-maleficence. We're not harming people once they're dead to remove their organs, if that's something that they wish and they're happy to do. And in a sense, beneficence, if you want to bring that up, like it's doing good to that person knowing that they've done something good in the world, I suppose. It gives them an opportunity to be useful even after death. And I think some people find real beauty in that.
That's good.
Those are some other things you could consider. The second question was, what are some of the reasons that people might wish to opt out or not be part of the scheme? And you brought up some really great points. I liked how you talked about personal experience. You know, you talked about something that was personal to you. You talked about your experience with your mum's work, and it created a more memorable response. And I think advice to all listeners, try to bring up personal things because it definitely creates a more memorable response to the interviewer. To the examiner. But other things you can bring up, for example, like the extent of the organ donation. So say, for example, if someone is donating skin, you know, how would that impact the burial, for example? So it's really about people's wishes and what they want to do with their afterlife, which is, I think, was the essence of your response. But also talk about other reasons. So the idea, for example, the bystander effect. Someone else will donate blood, someone else will donate their organs. that's a reason why I don't have to do it. And that's a very important concept in medicine in general. And then for question number 3, do you think people who opt out of schemes should be ostracized? I really loved how you handled this question. I'm glad you talked about privacy that shouldn't be getting out in the first place. And I'm really glad how you talked about people should just keep their mind open about other people's opinions and their choices.
So do you think, do you think with that one, I mean, like my mind was immediately drawn to a parallel of politics. And I think just in general, obviously, I'm not going to get into a political conversation in things. Is that even just a cursory mention? Is that kosher, or do you think that's a little bit?
No, that's a great analogy. And I like how you didn't go much into it, so you didn't open up another can of worms.
Yeah.
But yeah, I liked how you just touched on it and just left it there and just left it as a good analogy. It was a really clear, I think the way you communicate is really clear in general. Yeah, no, I thought that was really good. I didn't have much else in terms of that question to add. Yeah, I just thought you did really great. For question 4, I think this was a really challenging question. 4 and 5, they were both quite challenging, but I thought you handled them well. Question 4 was, do people who opt out of the scheme deserve to receive organs if one day they need them? The one parallel I want to make is that, if people choose not to give blood, they are still able to receive blood in a life-saving situation, where their life might be at risk. A really important concept in medicine is justice, is that we'll provide treatment to anyone who needs it, regardless of decisions they've made in the past, regardless of who they are, right? And so I think that's a really important thing to drill down and really show the examiner that you are thinking about this person's best interest. If someone does need life-saving organs.
I guess if I had time though, could I not contrast that with sort of allocation of resources? For example, if I'm a 60-year-old smoker, I'm probably less likely to get a lung transplant than a 24-year-old with, autoimmune or something.
Yeah, and I completely agree with what you're saying there. And I liked how you had an overall balanced view, and the idea that, like, if that incentive was in place, well, maybe that'd be really good at increasing the number of donations that are made, right? So I did like that how you had a balanced point of view, but I think you need to be really strong in your opinion that everyone deserves good care. And that is really, really clearly. And I think that's something that you could have improved. And then for question number 5, is there a situation in which rights of an individual should be sacrificed for the greater good? The vaccine analogy is fantastic. It's sort of what this question naturally leads towards. I think you handled it really well, talking about the importance of people being aware of their decisions and their consequences and how they affect people, and that how then becomes a trigger for us to be like putting rules and laws in place to protect everyone, right? And that is what happens in society. There are many, many cases in which this happens. Freedom of will doesn't necessitate that we that you must have freedom of will at all times. It definitely depends on like the situation. So another classic example, you talked about vaccines, but another classic example is actually is related to vaccines, but no jab, no play, for example, right? You can't send your kids to childcare unless they've had certain vaccinations. So that's for the greater good of everyone. And people might disagree with that, but it's an important thing to bring up. And I liked how you sort of handled that question. But that was really it. How do you think, in terms of feedback, is there anything you would change?
Yeah, I like the idea. I mean, look, you can't hit on everything, and I went over time. I do like that idea of bringing up justice in the question 4. I do think with these things, like, I think for me personally, something that I'm going to have to work on, well, not necessarily work on, but just be conscious of it, is being more measured, right? The way you would discuss this with mate, if a mate at a pub asks you something about this, that's probably how I actually talk in real life. I'm probably through working at pubs for so long, but it's also not how I want it. Like, I think it's good to keep that element. I probably just need to cut off a little bit in terms of being in an interview and being in a professional setting, like a medical interview. So I think maybe having a little bit more of a diplomatic view, or making sure that comes across, even though, if that makes sense. But no, I mean, I've been sort of spamming these podcasts and really have been cracking down the last little while. So I think sort of have a comfortable with these things. I think thankfully that wasn't super like context dependent. So I think it allows you to kind of just think about, your overall feelings for it. But no, that was really good. I really appreciate it.
No, also, I'm glad you had a good experience. And yeah, I like your points about remaining diplomatic and sort of considering things in a really logical manner. That's something that interviewers really love, to see that you have a really good systematic way of approaching ideas, especially ethical issues like this, because they will come up all the time in medicine. I really like that point that you brought up. But thanks for joining us on the podcast today. That's really it for today's episode.
Thanks so much, man. That was awesome.
No worries. For our listeners, just keep an ear out, I suppose, in terms of future episodes coming up. We'll be uploading more stations similar to this, so you guys can learn, practice. You can do what Mark does, which is, listen to the question, try to answer it yourself, and then have a listen to the responders' answers, and then the feedback afterwards, of course, which is obviously the most helpful part. All right, thanks for joining the episode today, guys. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. So there we have it. That was the ethical station run by myself and Mark. I hope that you guys learned something from Mark's responses as well as from some of my feedback. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at info@haladtohealth.org or email myself at KARIM@haladtohealth.org. The station was quite difficult, so if you have any questions, please reach out. And finally, just keep an eye out for our mock MMI rounds, which we run here in Melbourne with actual medical students that have sat MMIs before and obviously been successful. You'll get personalised feedback and a taste of the real thing. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Making of an Incredible MD podcast by Allied to Health. Please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the word about our podcast. And we'd love to hear your feedback, so send us an email or message on Facebook. All of our links are in the show notes. Thanks, we'll see you next time.